The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
What will it take to end the war in Ukraine? While the toll in lives and misery continue to rise this week, talks between Russia and Ukraine offered a glimmer of hope. Tonight, what happened and the prospects for peace. Then we'll hear from our Ontario hubs about a new home for the Sikh community in Timmins. And from Brampton's hopes for a new hospital to whether Canada can replace Russian oil and gas in the global marketplace. We've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, April 1st, and that's all coming up on the agenda. Despite global outrage, unprecedented sanctions against Russia, and fierce resistance from Ukrainian fighters, the war in Ukraine is now in its 5th week. But as the attacks keep coming, at least the two sides held talks aimed at ending the conflict. Joining us now on the substance of the negotiations and the state of the conflict. In Oxford, UK, Samuel Ramani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, who teaches politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. And in Silver Spring, Maryland, Melinda Herring, Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, so let's start with the current state of the invasion. I'm going to pull up a map to sort of get us started here. There is heavy fighting in the port city of Mariupol. It could fall within days, creating a land bridge for the Russians coming from Crimea. It's estimated that 100,000 civilians there are trapped, and many are starving. Russian forces have withdrawn some troops near Kiev. Ukrainians have kept them to the capital's outskirts. Shelling continues in the northern city of Chernihiv, and more Russian forces are being sent to the Donbas region in the southeast. They're facing some stiff Ukrainian resistance there. I'm going to start with both of you, but I'll start with Melinda. Is this the week Putin drastically softens his objective from his initial goal of regime change to something else?
Absolutely not. Putin's goals haven't changed. So the Kremlin is saying that it has finished phase 1 and is now moving into phase 2. And what that means, they claim that they are no longer trying to take Kiev and that they're going to focus on their efforts on the Donbas. I don't believe it, and I don't know any analysts who do. After they made that announcement, they continued to bomb Kiev and they continued to bomb in western Ukraine. They may be pulling their troops back, but it's only to attack again. That's the plan. They may be trying to buy themselves a bit of time.
Samuel, I'll get your take on that as well. Have things sort of changed when we're talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Well, I would absolutely agree with my colleague here. Not at all. I think that the statement from a U.S. official, which called this a redeployment and not a withdrawal, got it exactly right. The Russians have continued to launch attacks in Chernihiv in particular as a major area. In western Ukraine, they're targeting mostly fuel depots as well as arms facilities. And it appears as if, when you look at the rhetoric coming from many senior Russian officials, there's actually no change in the long-term goal of regime change. We saw the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman talk about how the leaders of the Kiev regime should be rounded up and held accountable for their crimes. We've seen repeated references to denazification and demilitarization, including from the Kremlin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, who said that was the core goal of the mission. Has no sign of moderation on the Russian part.
Melinda, I'm hoping we can get a sense of the fighting on the ground right now. What does it look like?
So right now, people are very focused on Mariupol, and we've seen horrific pictures there, indiscriminate shelling of civilians. The Russians have bombed hospitals, the drama theater, and it had the words written from the air, children outside of the drama theater. And right now, the breaking news is that there are 45 cars headed to Mariupol to help evacuate people. And the city has been unable to accept humanitarian resources. And the Ukrainians have been begging and pleading. Even the International Red Cross couldn't come in. So let's see how many people can get out. 45 vehicles, though, is not enough to evacuate the large number of people who really desperately need assistance. And I think it's worth saying, too, there's no clean drinking water there. There's reports of bodies being all over, and those bodies have not been buried, and they're contaminating the water supply. There's also reports that there's no food and that people have been forced to eat animals because there's simply no food. So the humanitarian supplies can't arrive quickly enough. But as Samuel said, the fighting continues. And I think another important point is that Vladimir Putin shows no sign whatsoever of really being willing to negotiate. When he speaks publicly, he's angry, he's emotional, and he hasn't gotten what he wants, which probably means that he's going to consider even more desperate tactics.
As we mentioned, Russia and Ukraine sat down for face-to-face talks in Turkey this week. That continued today via video link. Let's get a sense of what either side seems to be willing to give and take. So the Russians don't want Ukraine to pursue NATO membership. They don't want the Donbas region and Crimea to be considered Ukrainian territory. They said they would pull back forces in a major way from the cities of Kiev and Chernihiv. Notably absent from these talks were Putin's calls for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine or Russian language protections. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians said they would ensure they'd remain neutral, non-aligned, and non-nuclear, but that they would retain the right to join the EU. They also suggested a 15-year timeline for negotiating the status of Crimea. They called for an international security guarantee similar to NATO's Article 5. This would basically mean countries like the US, UK, Israel, Canada, and even Russia would be legally actively involved in protecting Ukraine. Finally, they said that they would not host foreign armies without the agreement of those said countries. I'll start with you, Samuel. Earlier this week, President Zelensky said peace talks have been positive signals. The UN Secretary General said that there's enough on the table to cease hostilities now. Big picture, any promising progress made in this week's talks?
Well, it's really hard to say whether there has been. The Russian point of view, at least the Russian representatives, are pointing a much more negative picture of what was happening, saying that no real progress has been made. First of all, I think that it's possible that a compromise could be struck between Zelensky and Putin about NATO membership, in part because Ukraine was nowhere near joining NATO. Even President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz over the past several months have said that it was a distant prospect to begin with. So even though that's the goal in the Ukrainian constitution, that's one thing that can be compromised on. The Ukrainians are talking about discussions about Crimea and Donbass, but it's important to keep in mind that the Russians are really not open to discussions on these topics. Dmitry Peskov completely ruled it out. And when you're looking at how the Russians are treating Donbass, you're noticing movements towards referenda in Luhansk and Donetsk, which will annex them properly into Russian territory, as well as economic agreements between Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and even newly occupied territories such as Kherson, which have been discussed over the past 48 hours in the Russian media, which suggests that Russia is seeking to integrate more and more territories that it's occupying into its immediate orbit or even into its territory. So I think even if agreements are struck on the NATO question or on WMDs on a foreign basis, which weren't issues to begin with, things will probably collapse on the territorial questions.
Melinda, the accusation has been made that Russia is using these peace talks to A, save face with the international community, and B, buy some time to prolong the war. What do you make of those?
Correct and correct. I think it's going to be very, very difficult, though. We are just seeing this isn't real. What happened this week was just another volley. The Russian side is not willing to negotiate, and the negotiations are going to be very tricky for a lot of the reasons that Samuel just outlined. But the Ukrainian side is not going to be willing to give up. Zelensky said, I'm not giving up Crimea, and I'm not giving up the Donbass. There's another tricky issue, though. It is a big deal. It's a big concession for Ukraine to say, we agree to NATO neutrality in exchange for security guarantees. The security guarantees part, though, is going to be the tricky part. So Ukraine remembers 1994. That is a big deal. In 1994, it gave up its nuclear arsenal. It was the third largest in the world in exchange for security guarantees from the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians. And they were betrayed, and they remember it. So in order to convince Ukraine to sign on to NATO neutrality, there's going to have to be real security guarantees, and they have to be more than an empty treaty. I think that's going to be a really hard sticking point.
Well, and I want to follow up with you on that. Is it likely that looking at Ukraine, that they could actually maintain their territorial integrity it had the day before the invasion? Do the borders change after all of this?
Honestly, we don't know. We have to see how things play out, and I'm not trying to evade your question. I think that this conflict is not a matter of days or weeks. It's likely to go on and drag on for a long time. I wish that weren't the case, but wars in this part of the world have a long history of dragging on. So the best judgment that I can give you is we have to wait and see.
Samuel, this idea is brought up by Ukraine's defense intelligence chief, making some comparisons to the Korean War. Could you envision a Ukraine split into different nations, similar to what happened after Korean War?
Well, I think that could be Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal. I mean, Vladimir Putin held a conversation with Polish President Donald Tusk about 7 or 8 years ago, where he was talking about precisely that scenario: Poland taking Western Ukraine and Russia taking over Eastern Ukraine. Of course, from the Polish point of view, that kind of annexation was preposterous. But the Russians have clearly had this on their mind for a very long time, probably even before Crimea was annexed back in 2014. So I think that is a conceivable scenario that they might be able to push for, but it would require them to achieve several things. It would require them not only to consolidate control over Mariupol and integrate Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea firmly together as one unit into Russia, but also likely making major moves on large eastern Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv and Odessa, which so far have been resilient in the face of the Russian onslaught. So it's an uphill struggle, but I can see the Russians pushing for this. And Polish president also made the statement yesterday saying that Russia could take potentially 1/3 of Ukraine and then come back to the negotiating table from a stronger position. I absolutely agree with Melinda, too, that the negotiations that are being held right now are not really being taken seriously inside Russia. We've seen Russian state media reports even calling Vladimir Medinsky, the chief negotiator, being part of the fifth column that Putin alluded to, just for the very nature of talking to the Ukrainian regime. And that shows how far the Russians are away from serious diplomacy.
If Russia gets what it wants, its sort of new goals here, what sort of message does that send to the other world powers, Samuel?
Well, it sends a very dangerous message to other world powers. It shows that revisionism and the annexation of territory can be achieved with a relative degree of at least military impunity, because Western countries are unwilling to take risks to combat Russia's aggression. They're unwilling to send fighter jets, unwilling to engage in a no-fly zone or peacekeeping missions or real tangible things that could eventually change the situation on the ground. It would also show on the flip side, obviously, if you want to defend Western policy, that there is a tremendous economic cost associated with this and economic isolation that will come with it. But whether those economic costs and this precedent will deter other powers with revanchist ambitions remains to be seen.
And Melinda, in that earlier board that we showed, we talked about Ukraine saying that they would be neutral. What does neutral Ukraine even look like?
To be honest, I'm not sure it's politically viable within Ukraine. I mean, that's a really big discussion right now, is would Ukrainians accept NATO neutrality after all the losses? So you have to remember, this is not Vladimir Putin's first rodeo in Ukraine. He's been at this since 2014. He illegally annexed Crimea and then went into the Donbass. And there's been 14,000 people who died before February 24th when he went into Ukraine again. So, I think a lot of it Zelensky has to be very smart and have his finger on the pulse of Ukrainian public opinion and not be willing to go further than his own people.
I'll follow up with you on that. Ukraine's ability to become fully independent and, sort of that idea, will it always be hampered because it shares borders with Russia?
It's definitely a big liability. Neighbors matter. Russia wants a buffer state between it and NATO, and Ukraine has been that buffer state. It wants Ukraine to stay where it is for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of historical reasons there. The Russians are completely condescending, and they look at the Ukrainians as little brothers. Putin also has an obsession with Ukraine, and he's unwilling to let it go. And basically, it boils down to, if Ukraine becomes a vibrant Slavic democracy, then Putin has no excuse for his backsliding. He can't continue to preside over an authoritarian Slavic country if Ukraine can succeed, because the countries are so similar. With their history, with their language, with their religion. So that's what this is about. This is about a threat to Putin's continuity.
Samuel, I'll follow up with you on that. Does Russia consider a Ukraine that is democratic, a member of the EU and NATO, a threat to its entire country?
Well, yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Melinda is saying over here. First of all, Russia does not necessarily view Ukraine as an independent country or a sovereign country. It views it as an artificial country. It views the Ukrainian situation to a large extent as a domestic issue, not a foreign policy issue. And given that, it will view the successful model of Ukrainian democracy as something that's threatening to authoritarian consolidation at home down the line, and not necessarily in the immediate tactical sense. I don't think that they were that worried, for example, when the Euromaidan revolution happened in 2014, that we would see immediate mobilizations in Moscow that were similar to that, even though they had them in 2011 and 2012. It's more the long-term precedent and the long-term goal that there'll be another model in the post-Soviet space, aside from the Russian-Belarusian model of what is now near totalitarianism. And that is a long-term threat to Putin's regime legitimacy.
Let's talk a little history here. You've said in the past that Russia suffers from Versailles syndrome. Samuel, what do you mean by that?
So when I spoke to Russian academics, and including one of a former Kremlin advisors, quite prominent, Sergei Karaganov, right, he's the dean of the Higher School of Economics, he used precisely that phrase to me. He used the phrase Versailles syndrome. And what he means by that is the fact that the Russians, from their point of view, felt humiliated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They went from basically being a superpower to being viewed by the West as basically a large gas station with nuclear weapons. So really a regional power at best. And then the Russians feel like they were not consulted on a number of international crises, including ones that are close to its orbit, like Serbia and Kosovo, and then later on Libya. And as a result of those supposed Western transgressions and the combined affront of losing their sphere of influence due to NATO expansion, the Russians are feeling that revisionism and the use of force is the only way to overturn this legacy of humiliation. And that narrative is very, very deeply set in Vladimir Putin's head, as well as the minds of many of his senior advisors in the defense establishment, and is driving much of Putin's conduct, including this current war in Ukraine.
Melinda, I don't know if we're truly able to understand or get in the mind of President Putin, but does President Putin seriously believe the U.S. and its allies are out to destroy Russia in its entirety?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is yes. He may have convinced himself of his own rhetoric, as Samuel just described. I mean, one of the big questions is, why did he go in now? And I think he went in for a number of reasons. One is a psychological reason. So Putin is an old, aging autocrat, and he wants to go down in the history books as a great leader. And when you look at who he admires, it's Stalin and Ivan the Great. So if you want to go down in history, in the Russian history books as a great leader, you take big swaths of land, and Crimea wasn't enough. But I think that Putin also saw opportunity. So yes, Samuel is right that in 2014, Putin didn't like the Euromaidan revolution, but it wasn't going to be, he wasn't going to see Ukraine become a vibrant democracy overnight. It's going to take a while. There's a lot of reform that needs to be done. But I think Putin saw opportunity. So he saw a weakness in Europe. Merkel was gone. He saw Biden is incredibly weak, and he was very weak after the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan. He saw Zelensky's numbers starting to slide. And he got everything he wanted in 2021. He got the summit with Biden. He got kid glove treatment over cyber. The list goes on and on and on. But he also saw increasing support for NATO in Ukraine. And he wants to do this on his timing. Samuel is exactly right that Putin has wanted to destroy Ukraine for a long time. And this was his chance. He decided there will not be more fortuitous circumstances. That's why he went in February.
Samuel, to what extent is Putin fueled by historical grievances alone, ignoring Russia's sort of economic and societal issues with all of these sanctions going on right now?
Well, I think that Vladimir Putin has also changed the foundations of his popular support and his regime legitimacy, as the Russian economy has not performed very well. And the poor economic performance and economic decline that we've been seeing in Russia does not necessarily just date back to the imposition of Western sanctions in 2014. It actually really has been a steady erosion since the end of Putin's first two terms. In 2008, with the Georgian war and oil prices hitting $147 a barrel and then declining with the financial crisis, the Russian economy has never really recovered its competitive position after that. So increasingly, Putin has been shifting the foundation of his legitimacy towards foreign policy identity construction. And that means the pursuit of great power status for the sake of it, which means getting back a sphere of influence through expansionist conduct in the post-Soviet space, especially Ukraine, asserting itself in global theaters, like we started to see in Syria and throughout the Middle East and Africa and other areas, and also creating a siege mentality, fortressization inside Russia, creating a warning about an imminent threat from everything from Ukrainian Nazis to Western encirclement of Russia via NATO to even NATO aggression against Russia. And it's very telling that when Putin invaded Ukraine now, he framed this, to, as well as being backed by his media outlets, as a response to an imminent NATO aggression against Russia. And that sums up the identity construction that he's been working on for the past 15 years.
President Zelensky has said only a face-to-face with President Vladimir Putin could end this war. Melinda, do you think this war only ends at the negotiating table as opposed to the battlefield?
I think the battlefield is key, and the Ukrainians have to continue to fight hard. They've fought very heroically. You know, looking back, we're 5 weeks into this. I think my community, the analytical community, made a big error. We overestimated the strength of the Russian military. We thought they were 10 feet tall. They're not 10 feet tall. You know, they're a disaster. They have food shortages. They have fuel shortages. They have people shortages. And the morale is very, very low. And the Ukrainian army has performed brilliantly. And, you know, we should have seen that. They've been fighting for 8 years. It's on their territory. And they also have, they have a command structure that's much different and much more flexible. So, you know, looking back, I think we made some pretty major errors. But look, the deal is going to, we don't know what the deal is going to be, but it all depends on the battlefield. If the Ukrainians can continue to hold the big cities and push the Russians back, you know, the longer time is on the Ukrainian side, the longer this goes, and the more that the Ukrainians can hold, the better the deal that they'll get. So it's incumbent on the West to continue to send defensive material as much as possible. And the West needs to have a little chat with itself about what escalatory weapons are. We need to make the MiG deal happen and send the Polish fighter jets as soon as possible. We need to be sending BTRs. We need to be sending air defense systems as well, so that Ukraine can defend itself. We need to stop being timid and weak and being afraid of Vladimir Putin.
Samuel, I'll get your take on that as well. Does this war end at the negotiating table or on the battlefield?
I think the war is going to end on the battlefield, first of all, because it much depends on the success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive that we've already started to see. The Ukrainians first taking over Irpin, and now allegedly even moving the counteroffensive into other areas further fledged into the country, like parts of Kharkiv district. And of course, much depends on Ukraine's ability to secure defensive weapons. And I think that there was an interesting statement from a Ukrainian MP recently, which says that the distinction between offensive and defensive weaponry, that's being often done by NATO and the United States, is kind of an affront, because this is entirely a war of self-defense on the Ukrainian side. They're fighting against Russian aggression on their sovereign territory. And if the Ukrainians can convince the West not just to give them defensive weapons, but also to give them weapons that would help their counteroffensive, so more offensively minded weapons, then that could help turn the tide as well and ensure that Russia, if it does come to the negotiating table, is not coming from a position of unparalleled strength. So that's why I think the battlefield is important, and Western arms provisions are very important at this time.
To have a follow-up on that, has the West's response emboldened Putin's response to this as well?
Well, it possibly could, and given the rhetoric that we're seeing coming out of Russia, and nothing can really be ruled out at this moment in time. I mean, we've already seen Russia experiment with a variety of military technologies, like clustering munitions. We're seeing them basically engage in banned anti-personnel landmines. We're seeing them allegedly use thermobaric bombs. And there's always the fear that they might escalate in the WMD sphere, particularly with the use of chemical weapons, which can be deniably done by striking a Ukrainian petrochemical facility. We already saw a leak from a chemical facility in Sumy. Or biological weapons, because they keep talking about all these bioweapons labs that are existing inside Ukraine, or even the dreaded one, the potential use of a tactical nuclear weapon, which has been hinted at by the repeated mentions of the nuclear button by Russian officials. So hopefully we don't go that far. But I think that Russia could escalate in unpredictable ways.
Does anything about what we're seeing play out in Ukraine this week give you optimism?
Well, the only thing that's kind of somewhat optimistic is that the two sides are talking to each other. But that really doesn't mean very much. There's too much countervailing pressure, even amongst Putin's core support base, not to take these negotiations seriously if they have not achieved a decisive victory at the battlefield. One thing that I'm noticing in Russian state media is a parallel with Kabasyurt. And Kabasyurt was the treaty that ended the First Chechen War. And the parallel is that we basically had a long war of attrition in Chechnya. We didn't achieve our desired goals, so we decided to compromise the battling table. And then 3 years later, we faced the threats of Chechen separatism, Islamic extremism, and terrorism, and we had to launch a much bigger war to finish what we should have finished a few years before. So given that kind of mindset, the Russians are not going into these talks with the intentions of actually striking a deal, and they're actually going in here just to buy time and resupply. Other signals, like the movement of Russian forces, including from Kiev and from Chernobyl into Belarus to resupply, are bad signs. The continued strikes on Kyiv and Chernihiv are bad signs. So I am looking at these talks with a great deal of skepticism, and I don't really see very much to be happy about or optimistic about at this time.
Melinda, in our last minute, I give you the last word. Do you see any optimism in this week's talks and moving forward?
I see optimism in Mariupol. Samuel is right about the military situation. There's not a lot to be optimistic about, but the fact that people are finally getting out of Mariupol, which has been the site of the worst human suffering. This conflict is about human suffering. It's a country of 40 or 41 million people. 10% of Ukrainians have had to flee their homes, and they're in the European Union now. The International Red Cross hasn't been able to get into Mariupol. So this is a very good thing that international humanitarian assistance is finally getting in, and that the Ukrainians are getting people out to safety. Let's build on it. Let's do more, and let's send more buses, and let's send more aid. Let's open our wallets as individuals as well, and ensure that people have access to drinking water, food, and a safe home.
Melinda, Samuel, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
The first Sikh temple was built in Canada in 1908. Today, there are Gurdwaras, as they're also referred to, across the country. And earlier this year, Timmins, Ontario, joined the list of cities to have one. Nick Dunne covers the Northeast for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us now from Sudbury with that. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Jayanne.
All right, so tell us the story behind the first Sikh temple in Timmins, Ontario.
Right, it's a very unlikely story, and it starts with a couple based out of Brampton named Kanwaljit Kaur Bains and her husband Bahadur. The Bains had come into Canada in the 80s, settling in the town of Mactier, just south of Parry Sound. They had set up a motel there for quite a bit, but eventually moved down to the GTA. They set up several of their own businesses, lived out their life, had kids, brought family over from India. And the initial spark towards Timmins was a desire for a retirement property. Bahadur was starting to look towards retirement, wanted maybe a cottage with a lake in the background, big property, and they have that in spades in the town in the region around Timmins, for a relatively affordable price. So they made their way up. They found properties. Got their home or their property, were looking to build the home. And just upon visiting Timmins, they kept coming across, these young Punjabi kids, international students for the most part from Northern College. And, the fact that there was a guy walking around in town with a turban, it kind of surprised them pleasantly. They would call back to them in Punjabi, talk to them, and, the conversation around the Gurdwara always kind of came about. There was no Gurdwara in town, and this is a very important cultural, religious space for Sikh people. And, after purchasing a property in the downtown, looking to perhaps expand one of their businesses, they decided, we're going to donate this, make it a Gurdwara, and invest the money to renovate this as a community space.
The Gurdwaras are obviously a place of worship, but this particular Gurdwara has a special importance in terms of community building, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Gurdwaras are also, more broadly a community space for people in the Sikh faith, and they're generally open to all. At least the Timmins Gurdwara is. It's a very recent phenomenon, this influx of particularly Indian and Punjabi and Sikh students coming to Northern College in Timmins. So there was this large influx, but there never really been that much community infrastructure, right? And, living in a northern town, it can be a little bit isolating, especially when you've traveled, halfway across the world to come and study and maybe live by yourself for the first time, in your life. So, this has become a very major spot for these students, for the broader Indian community to meet, to gather, to get to know each other and connect on top of whatever religious services they may want or need.
You spoke about Mr. and Mrs. Baines. Miss Baines is also known as Daisy to some of the locals there. She's kind of a mother figure to a lot of the young immigrants. What did she say about her role?
Right. Well, she just really embraced that role. She always kind of said that, in her paralegal business, she did more counseling sometimes than she did business. She's a very kind of sociable person. So for her to come in and to see these students, who immediately embraced her and, she embraced them, it means a lot to her. She's had students call to say that they got their first job or they acquired their permanent residency. On the other hand, students have come to her at the Gurdwara, after the loss of a family member in tears. And so she's been, for many of these students, in speaking to them, the first real parental figure they've had in Canada ever since they came here from India. So it's something that she takes very seriously, but it's something that she takes great pleasure in, and the students are very grateful for it as well.
In your article for TVO.org, you talk about one particular student, Navdeep Singh, who sort of had this kind of interesting story coming to Timmins, where he's traveling through the Canadian Shield and really has no idea where he's heading to. What was his initial reaction to the city?
Right. So just a bit of the background on Navdeep. He came here thinking that Northern College and Timmins was relatively close to Toronto, and that's a pretty big mistake. Timmins is about 800 kilometers north of Toronto. So he comes in from the airport, gets here, he hops onto an Ontario Northland bus, not really sure where he's going. And, about 5 hours down the road, up, Highway 69, getting into Sudbury, he's like, what's going on here? It's rocks, it's trees, it's swamps, it's lakes, you're winding through this rocky kind of isolated road where, there could be nothing for, an hour, right? Especially when you're going from Sudbury to Timmins on Highway 144. So, he's thinking like, where the heck am I going here? What is this forest or jungle, right? Eventually he gets into Timmins, and, he's relieved to see that there are some signs of, life there. There's, a Walmart, there's a McDonald's. So, you're not totally in the middle of nowhere. But even then, it wasn't very easy for him. English is not his first language. As an international student, you're paying more tuition fees. So there's a lot of pressure to work, and it's challenging when English isn't your first language. But over the years, he'd managed to kind of tough out those really difficult days for him, settle in. And now he volunteers at the Gurdwara every single day since it opened. It's been a lifeline for him. And now, he went from being in this position where he wasn't so sure if he wanted to stay in Timmins, get his permanent residency and, move to greener pastures. But ever since then, he feels that Timmins is his home, for the first time since he's been here, and he wants to stay here and bring his family over from India. And that's the case with many students and their stories in coming to Northern Ontario and Timmins.
Now, 2021 was actually a record year in Canada for immigrants coming over here. Can you give us a sense of how many immigrants there are in that particular region of Timmins and beyond?
Right. So generally speaking, in Northern Ontario, there is a challenge in retaining immigrants. According to Statistics Canada, there are just under 20,000 immigrants, from across the world in the Thunder Bay Census Metropolitan Area and the Sudbury Census Metropolitan Area. About half of those came here before 1980, and a little under 2,000 of those immigrants came here between 2011 to 2016. So it is a relatively small slice of the population. In the past number of years, there have been a number of programs to encourage immigration locally and, through the post-secondary institutions, encouraging and seeking international students. But on the whole of it, it is an inherent challenge bringing in immigration, let alone retaining people born and raised in Northern Ontario.
Nick Dunne, really great story, a heartwarming one at that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week evaluated what a massive new auto sector investment means for the future of electric vehicles and learned why Brampton, Ontario wants a new hospital to go with its new medical school. The agenda's Week in Review begins examining whether Canada can help wean the world off Russian oil.
One of the worst things that happened to the overall oil industry, and particularly the Canadian industry, is that pipelines move from boring infrastructure projects like highways to these kind of symbolic battlegrounds for the future of the global climate. And obviously, you get a lot of kind of complexity, flattened down into this one particular project. But I mean, what we're seeing right now, interestingly, is that for the first time in almost a full decade, we've seen the Canadian industry actually, at this exact moment, not pipeline constrained. We have very, very small differentials. We haven't needed to rely on rail. It's because we've got the Enbridge Line 3 replacement project that's finally come on stream. We're going to be getting the Trans Mountain expansion project online, hopefully anytime now into 2023, maybe early 2024. But I think when you think about the future and you think about the ability for Canadian industry to grow production and these kind of good friendly barrels kind of continuing to increase market share, the challenge is it's hard to imagine a private entity like TC Energy, what used to be TransCanada, or Enbridge or Kinder Morgan or any of the major pipeline companies. It's hard to imagine them staking a considerable commercial risk on building a new pipeline across the border again. It's just so impossible to achieve. So what we saw with the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline was obviously Ottawa effectively nationalized the pipeline, took it under federal ownership, effectively exercised kind of federal supremacy here and its ability to push through some of the provincial bottlenecks that we were facing, between Alberta and BC, for instance. And I for better or worse, I wonder if the future of pipeline construction in Canada is going to be one of nationalized projects that are effectively owned, operated by the government until such time that they are done, and then they can be resold to the private sector to manage. And I think that is not going to be a comfortable reality for many people in the industry, but I think that if we get another pipeline after Trans Mountain expansion, at this point right now, I think that's probably the way it's going to look.
Rachel, I'm going to come to you. It's a pipeline that I didn't think we would be talking about, the Keystone. Thought it was done in 2021, and maybe I'm joking here, but is the Keystone really dead forever, or does this change things at all?
Well, never say never. I mean, I think a lot of people in the industry and in Canadian government have a lot more gray hairs as a result of the pipeline. So, I mean, on the one hand, never say never. On the other hand, I do think that the political sort of capital and other things like that, it's not clear to me that there's the political will to sort of, revive that. It's been notable to me. Yes, there have been U.S., in a sense, the very same people in the U.S. who were against killing it in the first place at the beginning of last year have come out and said, well, this could be, sort of the solution. I think kind of focusing in on other issues, other ways of getting this sort of fuel to market, and maybe even other ways of coordination and bilateral relationships in this way might be more fruitful. The issue, though, is I think focusing in on areas of broader, broader, longer term interest. I mean, the sort of issues that are faced on a bilateral basis around not just oil and gas, but also power exports and the like, of course, are politically fraught. And navigating this in a context where, yes, the U.S. wants reliable energy, but also is moving towards much more sort of onshoring in a variety of areas. And so I think there's an element for Canada even in the energy sector, of sort of picking battles and, particularly on infrastructure projects that are closer to sort of being done or nearer sort of payouts.
In the last sort of 2 minutes that I have, I do want to ask this question, Stacey and Rory. I'll start with Stacey. What are the lessons you hope our leaders are taking away from the war in Ukraine as it pertains to Canadian oil and gas?
I mean, I think that the biggest lesson they should see is that, Russia was able to use their energy resources politically and in a way where they could go into Ukraine. Canada has a role to play here, especially on the LNG side. We have some of the largest natural gas resources in the world, and we would have the ability to ship LNG to Europe from the East Coast of Canada and to Asia from the West Coast. Over the last 10 years, the Americans have built probably 10 LNG projects, and over the last 15 years, we'll be lucky to get one done. So if anything, I think Canada contribute resources to market that can stabilize both in Asia and in Europe. So Canada does have a role to play here, but it's going to take a commitment from all levels of government to get our safe, reliable resources to market.
All right, and Rory, what are the lessons our leaders can take away from sort of what's going on when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine when it comes to Canadian oil and gas?
I think the biggest thing to take into consideration here is that this industry moves very slow. We need to be very, very purposeful, very, very thoughtful, and forward-looking in our decisions. I think after oil prices collapsed in 2014, as an example, a lot of people more or less wrote the industry off, that this wasn't something that needed, love and care anymore. It was just something that was going to more or less keep producing until we didn't need it anymore because everything was electrified. And I think that set up a false sense of security about kind of the effort and risks inherent in that energy transition. We are undeniably heading towards a decarbonized net zero future, but the path, the drive along that bridge to transition is going to be fueled in many cases by gasoline and diesel until we've fully displaced those fuels from our mix.
Joanna, pick up the story if you would, because apparently just because we build EVs in this province doesn't mean that Ontarians are flocking to buy them. And in fact, the stats I have seen say we're a little bit behind other jurisdictions when it comes to actually putting our dollars where our feet on the pedal go. If that's not a terrible metaphor, I don't know what is. Anyway, why have we been slow to pick up on the EV purchasing route?
Absolutely. Well, I think Doug Ford's vision for EVs in the province, it's sort of missing half the equation, right? Which is actually helping Ontarians drive electric vehicles. So just because we're building them, that's not necessarily going to translate into higher levels of EV uptake in the province. And it's not going to translate into emission reductions in our, one of our most polluting sectors, the transportation sector, unless and until the Ford government does more to support Ontario drivers to go electric.
And what would that look like in your view?
Well, let's take a look at leading provinces in Canada, BC and Quebec. Right now, we're really seeing a tale of two Canadas when it comes to EVs. In BC and Quebec, 1 in 10 every new cars is electric. You can access provincial rebates to stack on top of the federal one. There's support to install home charging stations, and automakers are required by law to sell more EVs in those provinces. It's no wonder 80% of Canada's EV sales happen in those two provinces, and automakers send all their EV inventory over there. Ontario, on the other hand, is seeing only 3% of new car sales being electric. That is lower than the national average. It's even lower than the Yukon on a per capita basis. It's because we don't have any of these policies in place. And it's also meaning that Ontario drivers are finding it impossible to find an EV to buy. So I think we've got to look to some of those leading provinces and move forward with some similar policies if we really want to unlock the cost saving and emission reduction benefits that these vehicles provide.
Brendan, let me get you back in here because Joanna has accurately laid out the situation as it exists today. But it's actually worse if you go back a few years, and I'll just put a few things on the record here. When Doug Ford became Premier in 2018, he ended the cap-and-trade system. He ripped out all the charging stations that the previous government had begun to build. He took away all the subsidies for purchasing green cars. That was the EV rebate program. And now he is sort of portraying himself as, the greenest premier around and the guy who's led a revolution of EV in the province of Ontario. There's an old expression, you can't suck and blow at the same time. Do you think they're doing that?
Well, when it comes to some of the consumer incentives, I think they're a zero-sum way to get a few cars on the road today. They don't address the actual problems about the supply, the low supply of EVs in North America. They also don't actually address the problem that EVs cost a lot today. The best way to address this is to invest in manufacturing, to help manufacturers achieve scale and achieve profitability so we can bring the price of EVs down over the long term. I'd also, like to point out that these consumer incentives, whether they're federal, whether in British Columbia, whether they're in Quebec, they're all going to imported vehicles. And so I think there's no denying that they can help get a few vehicles on the road in the short term. In the longer term, investing in manufacturing, investing in Ontario manufacturing in order to help companies achieve scale, help companies achieve profitability, is the longer term solution to consumer adoption, among other things.
Greg, can I get your take on that? How do you portray yourself as the greenest guy going, given the history of what they did 3.5 years ago?
Well, I think there's a lot. I think we can throw a lot of blame around, but the reality is that Canadians and Ontarians are not buying electric vehicles because Ontarians and Canadians buy vehicles that are in a $35,000 or $40,000 price range, and the vehicles that the manufacturers are offering right now are at the top end of that. They're $55,000, they're $65,000, they're $80,000, and people look at that and say, "I'm not quite ready yet. I'll wait a little bit, and until the industry rounds itself out so that it meets what's happening." And Joanna can talk to this a little bit more. What's happening in Southeast Asia, what's happening in Europe, where there are more lower cost vehicles, electric vehicles that are available. We're not buying electric vehicles because the electric vehicles that are available and are on offer right now in Canada are not what the market really wants right now, or consumers really want right now.
Okay, I take your point on that, but Joanna, let me hammer this point home one more time on the political end of things, because you raised it in the first place. And that is, we're about to go into an election campaign here in the province of Ontario where the Premier is going to be crowing about what a great environmental/EV record he has, sales up, infrastructure up, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of conveniently ignores what he did for the previous 3 years that he was in power. You're in the environmental movement. How does it look from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I think the fact that Ford has been so reluctant to bring these EV rebates back is not only bad news for Ontario drivers who are missing out on the fuel cost savings that EVs provide, particularly when we're seeing these sky-high gas prices right now. But they're also sending the reluctance is also sending the wrong message to auto and battery makers who are looking to set up shop in the province. I think we need to be focusing on building a domestic market to ensure that there are buyers for the products that those companies are going to be selling and help to justify further investments. Just to go back to Brendan's point, I agree we need to be investing in manufacturing, looking to reach economies of scale, but I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and. We need to focus on the demand side and help consumers afford electric vehicles while they're still seeing higher sticker prices than comparable gas models, which is expected to change in just a few years, as well as supporting manufacturing.
Honestly, I think the any sort of expansion of healthcare capacity in the region of Peel will certainly help to shore up, what really presented a significant issue in terms of the foundation of our pandemic response. As Councillor Santos identified, we throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic really saw laid bare the inequities and disparities that have existed in the healthcare system. So again, going back to what Natalie was saying, as long as we're getting that additional capacity to be helpful, it's worth reminding though, that healthcare and hospitals are really just the start. As I mentioned as well, one of the other things that we do know as well is that Peel Public Health is the lowest per capita funded health unit in the province of Ontario. And that is, again, due to the significant population growth that has occurred. And similar to the hospital and healthcare system, we are going to also need additional support as a public health unit in order to both recover from this pandemic response and to be able to really aim for overall health protection and health promotion that will ultimately help to reduce demand and strain on the acute care capacity as well that we do have in our community.
Councillor Santos, what's your understanding of what's being planned?
Yeah, so at the City of Brampton, I'm currently on break from a council meeting where later on we're going to be discussing how we're going to make up for our local share owing to the building of the hospital. And, one of the big challenges, I think, which is also unfair, is the fact that municipalities in particular are expected to come up with 10% of the funds to actually build a hospital. And from my perspective, I think that it's owing to Brampton that the province do a lot more than just expect Brampton to now come up through property taxes 10% of the share to build the hospital. So I think we have a funding issue as well when it comes to the province. We need to make sure that municipalities aren't using the property tax base to pay for hospitals, which are massive infrastructure projects, which quite frankly should be going to Peel Public Health and supporting regional Peel Public Health issues, not building massive infrastructure projects that are the responsibility of the province.
Can you just can you do a fact check with me on that? Is that a new provision requiring municipalities to come up with 10% of the capital cost for hospitals? I wasn't aware of that.
It's an expectation of us, that's for sure. And so we have been going back and forth, Dr. Lowe knows this as well, between the city and the region to come up with $125 million at the local level, whether that's made up from Brampton or from the region. There's this expectation that the local municipalities will fund 10% of it. And so, let's upload those downloads again. The residents, property taxpayers aren't able to afford the massive costs related to, again, a project that's the responsibility of the province.
Natalie, $125 million on property taxpayers. Is that who should be paying for that?
No, and I mean, especially in Brampton, because remember, Brampton, part of the reason why the redevelopment of the Peel Memorial, which was supposed to happen more than a decade ago, hasn't happened, is because Brampton was the experimental site of the first privatized P3 hospital. And I don't want to take away anything from what Rowena said about, kind of racism in public policy, or at least not paying attention to the needs of diverse communities. Because there's, you can see Oakville has a new hospital, Vaughan has a new hospital, Brampton has been waiting all along without access to services, with terrible, falling further and further behind. These things shouldn't be political footballs. They shouldn't depend on who you vote for at all, and they don't. I think that's a really dangerous thing to say. But the $125 million to be raised by the community has more than been raised before, because the cost of the first hospital, which was a privatized P3, went through the ceiling. I mean, it was supposed to be $250 million, then $315, then $325. Ultimately, it ended up around $650 million for that hospital. It shrunk in size because the costs escalated so much, and then it ate up the Peel Memorial redevelopment, and the community never got the second hospital. Brampton has more than paid. As I recall, I think Brampton raised something like $250 million for that first hospital. They could have paid for it all with, themselves without ever going to the province. They shouldn't have to pay a cent. And on principle, this policy of 10% local share, it's harder on communities that are poorer. It's bad policy.
Well, let me pick up on that with Dr. Lowe. It is an empirically provable fact that the population of Brampton has a significantly higher percentage of racialized Ontarians than most places in the province, maybe than any other place in the province. Do you think that you can draw a direct line between that fact and the fact that it has received such a disproportionately less amount of funding for its health care?
Well, I don't think you can necessarily draw that direct line, but I think the bigger point that you're making, though, is that a lot of the diversity, a lot of this really complex situation that we have in Brampton and in the region of Peel owes to the fact that there are a lot of inequities and disparities that exist. That's why health equity is a strategic priority for our public health unit here at Peel Public Health. That's why we also recognized throughout the COVID-19 pandemic that ultimately it wasn't that the pandemic created these inequities or disparities. They're the same health inequities and disparities that we saw even prior to the pandemic. Many of these groups face higher rates of chronic disease, higher rates of mental illness, higher rates of injuries that are all related to the socioeconomic and ethnocultural diversity that we have in our community. And so I think that really speaks to, what I always say is that I think the pandemic really it just uncovered, these inequities and disparities and put them in the spotlight. And how interesting it is that it is a disease that spreads from person to person that reminded us all that we're ultimately all connected, and ultimately this is a community that we do need to come together for.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And speaking of our website, tvo.org has a brand new look online. For the latest Ontario current affairs from our digital team, from The Agenda, of course, and for all of our podcast documentaries and programs, check out the slick new website at tvo.org. And that's all for this Friday, April 1st, 2022. Monday on the program, what's at stake for Ontario municipalities as they deal with cyber attacks virtually every day in this province. I am Jane Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a good weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.